Today we are continuing with Holes and we are going to be reading chapter 5. As we're reading today, we are going to be focusing on setting a reading goal for ourselves. Not only do you get to decide what you want to read, but you also decide what you want to focus on and pay attention to as you read. And whatever you pick to focus on or pay attention to, that can be a goal for yourself. So today we're going to be setting goals. Some examples of reading goals that you could set for yourself: retelling events, summarizing main ideas of what you're reading, thinking deeply about characters and their thoughts, words, and actions. These are just a few examples. Once you have your goal, you need to think of a way to monitor your goal. And monitor means to keep track of your goal and check it. It's important that you monitor or stop to check your goal. You could stop after a certain number of pages that you read, a certain amount of time. So maybe you'd say, I'm going to check my goal after every 5 minutes of reading. Or it could be at the end of a chapter. What will you do with your reflections? Some ideas include, you could recite your reflections aloud. You could write them in your notebook or put them into a Post-it note and put that into your book. So here's an example of sentence stems that we can use to set goals. My goal is to blank. To accomplish this goal, I will blank. So for the first blank, my goal is to, that's where you insert your goal. To accomplish this goal, I will insert how you'll meet this goal. So I'm going to give you an example of one that we're going to be using today as we read Holes. My goal is to retell the events taking place in Holes. To accomplish this goal, I will stop after every 2 pages of reading and retell the events aloud. As we're reading today, we are focusing on retelling what happens in Holes. And we're going to do this by stopping after every 2 pages. And you will all help me accomplish this goal. So as we're reading today, think of the events taking place and we will stop after every 2 pages. There were 6 large gray tents, and each one had a black letter on it, A, B, C, D, E, or F. The first 5 tents were for the campers. The counselors slept in F. Stanley was assigned to D tent. Mr. Pendanski was his counselor. My name is easy to remember, said Mr. Pendanski as he shook hands with Stanley just outside the tent. 3 easy words: pen, dance, key. Mr. Sir returned to the office. Mr. Pendanski was younger than Mr. Sir and not nearly as scary looking. The top of his head was shaved so close it was almost bald, but his face was covered in a thick, curly black beard. His nose was badly sunburned. Mr. Sir isn't really so bad, said Mr. Pendanski. He's just been in a bad mood ever since he quit smoking. The person you've got to worry about is the warden. There's really only one rule at Camp Green Lake. Don't upset the warden. Stanley nodded as if he understood. I want you to know, Stanley, that I respect you, Mr. Pendanski said. I understand you've made some bad choices in your life. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But everyone makes mistakes. You may have done some bad things, but that doesn't mean you're a bad kid. Stanley nodded. It seemed pointless to try and tell his counselor that he was innocent. He figured that everyone probably said that. He didn't want Mr. Pendanski to think he had a bad attitude. I'm going to help you turn your life around, said his counselor, but you're going to have to help too. Can I count on your help? Yes, sir, Stanley said. Mr. Pendanski said, good, and patted Stanley on the back. Two boys, each carrying a shovel, were coming across the compound. Mr. Pendanski called to them. Rex, Alan, I want you to come say hello to Stanley. He's the newest member of our team. The boys glanced wearily at Stanley. They were dripping with sweat, and their faces were so dirty that it took Stanley a moment to notice that one kid was white and the other black. What happened to Barfbag? Asked the black kid. Lewis is still in the hospital, said Mr. Pendanski. He won't be returning. He told the boys to come shake Stanley's hand and introduce themselves like gentlemen. Hi, the white kid grunted. That's Alan, said Mr. Pendanski. My name's not Alan, the boy said. It's Squid, and that's X-Ray. Hey, said X-Ray. He smiled and shook Stanley's hand. He wore glasses, but they were so dirty that Stanley wondered how he could see out of them. Mr. Pendanski told Alan to go to the rec hall and bring the other boys to meet Stanley. They led him inside the tent. Again, our goal, retell the events that just took place. Write the events that just took place in the chat. There were 7 cots, each one less than 2 feet from the one next to it. Which was Lewis's cot? Mr. Pendanski asked. Barfbag slept there, said X-Ray, kicking one of the beds. All right, Stanley, that'll be yours, said Mr. Pendanski. Stanley looked at the cot and nodded. He wasn't particularly thrilled about sleeping in the same cot that had been used by someone named Barfbag. 7 crates were stacked in 2 piles at one side of the tent. The open end of the crates faced outward. Stanley put his backpack, change of clothes, and towel in what used to be Barfbag's crate. It was at the bottom of the stack that had 3 in it. Squid returned with 4 other boys. The first 3 introduced themselves by Mr. Pendanski as Jose, Theodore, and Ricky. They called themselves Magnet, Armpit, and Zigzag. They all have nicknames, explained Mr. Pendanski. However, I prefer to use the names their parents gave them, the names that society will recognize them by when they return to become useful and hard-working members of society. It ain't just a nickname, X-Ray told Mr. Pendanski. He tapped the rim of his glasses. I can see inside you, Mom. You've got a big fat heart. The last boy either didn't have a real name or else he didn't have a nickname. Both Mr. Pendanski and X-Ray called him Zero. You know why his name's Zero? Asked Mr. Pendanski. Because there's nothing inside his head. He smiled and playfully shook Zero's shoulders. Zero said nothing. And that's Mom, a boy said. Mr. Pendanski smiled at him. If it makes you feel better to call me Mom, Theodore, go ahead and call me Mom. He turned to Stanley. If you have questions, Theodore will help you. You got that, Theodore? I'm depending on you. Theodore spit a thin line of saliva between his teeth, causing some of the other boys to complain about the need to keep their home sanitary. You were all new here once, said Mr. Pendanski, and you all know what it feels like. I'm counting on every one of you to help Stanley. Stanley looked at the ground. Mr. Pendanski left the tent, and soon the other boys began to file out as well, taking their towels and change of clothes with them. Stanley was relieved to be left alone, but he was so thirsty he felt as if he would die if he didn't get something to drink soon. Hey, Theodore, he said, going after him, do you know where I can fill my canteen? Theodore whirled and grabbed Stanley by his collar. My name's not Theodore, he said. It's Armpit. He threw Stanley to the ground. Stanley stared up at him, terrified. There's a water spigot on the wall of the shower stall. Thanks, Armpit, said Stanley. As he watched the boy turn and walk away, he couldn't for the life of him figure out why anyone would want to be called Armpit. In a way, it made him feel a little better about having to sleep in a cot that had been used by somebody named Barfig. Maybe it's a term of respect. That is the end of chapter 5, and that was also 2 additional pages. And our goal is retell the events that just took place. Please write the events that just took place in the chat. Thank you, Team Persevere.